How many people live in Azeroth? About 1.2 million. Sort of. Not really. I'll explain. Human players on their way out of Northshire are given these documents. Page 3 mentions that wolves are causing problems with the farmers. What farmers? There is one vineyard and some people cutting up trees, but that's about it. This highlights the stark difference between the Azeroth in-game in World of Warcraft and the Azeroth behind the game that the game is trying to represent. Hard as they may try, technical and time limitations stop developers from creating perfectly simulated fantasy worlds, and so compromises need to be met. And once you're aware of this game's compromises, you can't help but be curious. What is the real Azeroth like? Whilst video games are limited in scale, your imagination isn't. And so Warcraft RPG, the officially licensed tabletop adaptation, has our answers. Over the years, several sourcebooks were published. Important to us is 2004's Lands of Conflict and 2006's Lands of Mystery. Inside is Bran Bronzebeard's journey across Azeroth.
The answers are here. I can feel it.
The former book covering the Eastern Kingdoms and the latter covering everywhere else. So, back to Northshire. How many people live there? 500. A lot more than in-game. What about in Elwyn Forest in general? 10,000. With the vast majority living in Goldshire, which makes sense because it's a forest. Goldshire, by the way, has a population of 7,000. I checked in-game, Goldshire has a population of about 35. That's a ratio of 200 to 1. Also, Eastvale Logging Camp has 1,000 people living in it. Can you imagine a logging camp employing 1,000 people? And interestingly, the population of Elwyn is only 70% human. It's full of dwarves and, notably, high elves. 5% of all high elves still alive live here. And since we're right outside the gates anyway, let's check in on Stormwind. Population 200,000, and only 70% human. 10% are high elves, and 14% are dwarves. Also listed as a demographic are half elves, something not really touched upon in the games outside of a couple of characters. But enough alliance bias, let's head over to Orgrimmar. Orgrimmar only has a population of 14,000, of which 80% are orcs, 13% are jungle trolls, 12% are Tauren, and 5% are Forsaken, because Blizz can't count. A further 7,000 live outside in Durotar, of which 2,000 are from Sen'jin Village, the home of the Darkspear trolls after the events of Warcraft 3. Trolls make up for around 10% of the planet's population, and in case you didn't know, they're divided into several different tribes. The Forest Trolls, who are primarily of the Amani tribe, make up over 3/4 of all trolls in the Eastern Kingdoms. Another race that's divided into its own subgroups that's also very prominent in the Eastern Kingdoms are dwarves. There are the Ironforge dwarves, the ones that everyone knows about, the Wildhammer dwarves that fly around on griffins up in the hinterlands, and the Dark Iron dwarves, arguably the main bad guys of Vanilla WoW. Apparently there are only about 3,000 of them. For every Dark Iron dwarf, there are about 22 Ironforge dwarves. No wonder they lost. Another thing is that there are more Ironforge dwarves living in Stormwind than in Ironforge, which makes no sense. Okay, I'm out of good segues to make, so I'm just going to list off a load of interesting facts. There aren't really that many Forsaken, the faction the undead players are a part of. There's about 18,000 of them, and understandably, about 16,000 of them live in Tirisfal. Nearly half of all gnomes have left Dunmorrow, and can be found all over the place. Most interestingly, alongside goblins at the Mirage Raceway in the Thousand Needles zone. The Raceway, by the way, apparently has a population of 1,000, way more than in-game. There are only about 1,000 Draenei in the Eastern Kingdoms, these being the pre-Burning Crusade version. There exist around 500 half-orcs, and nearly 10,000 half-elves. Of the playable races, there are twice as many Alliance as Horde. And finally, there are about 180 Tauren in the Undercity. Way before the Battle for Azeroth expansion made the area playable, Kul Tiras was in this sourcebook. Kul Tiras, including Crestfall, an island off to the northeast, has a population of about 10,000, of which 80% are human. Boralis, its capital, hosts 4,000 people, which, whilst large, pales in comparison to Stormwind. Also within entry is the Broken Isles. About 2,000 people are said to live here, mostly creatures like murlocs and naga, but also some goblins, who seem to get everywhere. The Eye. The huge rift between Azeroth's continents is where the Well of Eternity used to be, but according to Bran Bronzebeard, it may still be here, just really far down, in the rift. Above the rift is the city of Nazjatar, where the Naga live under Queen Azshara. There's thought to be around 50,000 Naga living there. Khazan. Though we don't know much about the Isle of Khazan until it gets blown up in Cataclysm, this sourcebook provides us with lots of information. It has a population of around 40,000, of which about 3/4 are goblins. Its capital, Undermine, is a subterranean city in volcanic caverns. The volcanic activity underneath this part of the world has created several volcanic cave systems. The goblins have built glass tunnels between them, almost like the tunnel of a deep-run tram. Plunder Isle, the headquarters of the Bloodsail Buccaneers. Duke Falrevere runs this big group of pirates. The fortress itself only houses about 500, but outside the fortress is a huge population of murlocs and basilisks. The basilisks have turned countless treasure seekers into pure stone, their statues filling the island's jungle just as much as the trees do. Zandalar. Once the seat of the ancient Zandalari Empire of Trolls, Zandalar now only houses about 25,000 of them, under the rule of King Rastakhan. In all troll cultures, Zandalar is said to be a kind of spiritual homeland, especially the great city of Zuldazar, where most of the Zandalari trolls live. This city of towering ziggurats could be mistaken for mountains, if not for the lack of snow on its constructed peaks. Okay, enough adventure. Let's get back to what everyone likes the most: population statistics. Pretty much everyone who plays World of Warcraft has their own favourite race. And now we get to find out, at least according to these sourcebooks, which are the most populous, starting with the least up to the most. Coming in at last are, expectedly, the gnomes. The gnomes were never a huge civilization, and after the disaster at Gnomeregan cast them away from their homeland, they've since been scattered. There are now only about 5,500 gnomes left. Next up, the undead. With only about 18,000 members, this is the smallest of the Horde factions. Bear in mind though that this is only the Forsaken I'm talking about, not all undead. There are a lot more undead, more on that later. Forsaken are a unique group with a unique backstory, so I guess it does kind of make sense that they're quite small. Next up, only slightly more populous, are the Tauren. The nomadic Tauren outside of Thunder Bluff don't really have any population centres, and so I suppose it's not too surprising that they only number around 23,000. Next up, and this one is probably the most interesting, are Orcs. With a population of only around 34,000, the Orcs are way less populous than their Alliance counterparts. According to these numbers, it's surprising that the Horde can field enough manpower for one battle, never mind a war. Next up are the Night Elves, who number around 53,000. The until quite recently isolationist Night Elves are surprisingly a huge nation. Usually in RPGs, elves are few in number, but great in skill, though since their local enemy the Orcs are numbered around 20,000 less than they are, I guess that's not true in Warcraft. In third place are the Dwarves. Whilst altogether they number over 100,000, the Ironforge Dwarves in particular, the only dwarf clan in the Alliance, numbers around 67,000, which is still a huge amount. The majority of dwarves live either in Ironforge or in Stormwind, though they have expeditionary forces all across Azeroth. numbering around 110,000 are the trolls. But this does get a bit confusing, because while the first sourcebook, Lands of Conflict, lists trolls by their tribe, the second sourcebook, Lands of Mystery, doesn't, so it's quite confusing. Subtracting the trolls not aligned with the Horde would probably knock them down a place, but I feel bad for them, so I'm going to keep them in second. I know this ranking system is a bit arbitrary, but then again, so are the statistics I'm using. And in first place, drumroll please, is the humans, with a population of around 220,000, most of which living in the city of Stormwind. Now, in most fantasy settings, humans are the most populous race, so this does make sense really, but they are twice the population of the trolls. The human population far eclipses the population of the entire Horde. Just think about that. It's a bit silly, isn't it? But there is one group whose number is larger than that of the humans. Far larger. By far, the most populous demographic on Azeroth are the Scourge. Coming in at nearly 30% of the world's population are the undead. There are around 343,000 of them, and more than half of them are concentrated in one single place: Icecrown. Bran Bronzebeard speculates that there could be around 250,000 undead waiting for the Lich King's command. This statistic, more than I think anything I've read before, puts into perspective the apocalyptic proportions of the Scourge. Factor in this huge number and the fact that they can resurrect their victims. The Scourge are the biggest threat on Azeroth. The world would have to unite to bring down the Lich King and his forces, which is pretty much what happens. Okay, that's enough statistics for me. So, how many people live in Azeroth? The number calculated here, adding up all of the populations throughout both of the source books, is 1,172,442. But there are a few reasons you can't trust this number. Firstly, because of the unreliable narrator. These source books are meant to be written in-universe by Bran Bronzebeard, leaving a convenient room for error. They're just ballpark numbers anyway to help tabletop players get a good sense of the scale of the universe. Another reason is that they just don't make sense. Some of these populations are just way too low, in fact all of them are. The biggest city, Stormwind, with a population of 200,000, is a bit weird, especially considering there are more dwarves living there than there are dwarves living in Ironforge. So yeah, these statistics don't really seem very proofread. And on top of that, all of these calculations come from a spreadsheet that I've had my hand in making, and I can't count. And on top of that, sadly, the Warcraft RPG is no longer canon, though the blue post stating their lack of canonicity was made in 2011, and since I'm a classic player, I can freely stick my head in the sand on that one. In my incredibly distorted view of the world, the Warcraft RPG books are canon, and this blue post isn't, because it hasn't happened yet. Thanks for watching. There's loads of juicy information for Warcraft fans in these old RPG source books, and if you want me to make more videos about them, I definitely will. Please let me know in the comments.